So you want to start investing in comic books, but you just don't know where to start. Well, in this video, I'm going to show you exactly everything you need to know about investing in comic books. I'm going to show you which comic books are worth investing in and which comic books you should probably stay away from. I'm going to show you key metrics on how to determine even what comic books are investable in the first place. To show you what is possible, that comics not only can be fun to collect, but also can be an investment, here are some examples of some ROI or return on your investment for comic books. We got an Action Comics #1. This is the first appearance of Superman, who is also considered to be the very first superhero. At a CGC 3.0, 10 years ago, this comic sold for about $300,000. Now it sells for over $1.6 million. That is an increase of 446%. To compare that to other things such as like stocks and real estate, you got the S&P 500 in that same time period going for a little over $1,500, now selling for $3,800. And that's up 149%. In real estate, the national median home price was about $258,000. Now it's around $467,000. That is an increase of 81%. And if you look down below, you'll see some other stocks to give you some comparisons. The Dow Jones in that same 10-year period was up 120%, GM 34, Amazon up 593, Apple 837, and Berkshire Hathaway up 195%. Also, another example is Amazing Fantasy 15 at a 5.0. 10 years ago, it was almost $13,000, now selling for nearly $50,000. That's an increase of 288%. Also, we got is a Hulk 181 at a CGC 9.0. 10 years ago, it was selling for $1,600. Now that sells for nearly $10,000. That is up 512%. Now, if you're confused with a lot of those terms, like CGC 9.0, even what is a Hulk 181, don't worry, I'll explain all that later in this video. So you might be asking yourself, should you just go to your local comic shop and pick up the latest hot craze? Or maybe you should watch some of those top 10 videos that are on YouTube or circulating on blogs and pick up some of those. Those seem like a good investment, right? You also heard that maybe an old comic book. Old comic books are the ones that hold value, so you'll just go and buy some 1960s comic book and that should go up over time, right? Well, not necessarily. Now, some of those aren't exactly good investment choices. Now remember, with all investing, there does come risk. There's no guarantees. A wise man once said, "In life, there are no certainties except death and taxes." But hopefully with this information I'm about to give you, this will help you make a better sound investment into comic books. Now, I've been in this business my entire life, and I'm going to pass on all the knowledge that I know and have learned onto you. So where do you even start? A lot of people tend to go towards things that they had as they were a kid. Is that a good idea? Well, usually not, because it depends on how old you are. Also, one of the main issues is people tend to gravitate towards the ones that they personally liked. But just because you like it doesn't mean everyone else likes it, and it also doesn't mean it's investable. Imagine you're a kid and you pick up your very first comic ever, New Mutants 41. And you love that book, and the next thing you know, you're reading all the current New Mutants comics. Now, you're older and you go back and you pick up that one. Surely that's got to be an investable comic, right? I mean, it's old, it's from the 80s. It's New Mutants, so it's Marvel. It's got name brand recognition. They even made a movie of the New Mutants. Wrong. That comic book is not investable and probably will never be. So first, let's break down what makes a comic book valuable to begin with. Well, the main thing is supply and demand. Supply is easy. It's how many exist of an older comic book, and also how many were printed of a new comic book or so-called modern comic book. So now demand. What creates demand? Well, usually it's the title and issue. That could be something like Amazing Spider-Man #8. That is the title character and the issue number, which is how many from the first issue, which is the first time it came out, versus now it can go all the way up to, in the hundreds, maybe even to the thousands. Then you got things that are like first appearances, like a Hulk 181. A first appearance is the first appearance of a certain character. That could be the main character in that title, or it could be simply down the issue line, another character appears like Wolverine in Hulk 181. Then you got second appearances. That's the second time a character has appeared, like Marvel Spotlight #6. That is the second appearance of the Johnny Blaze Ghost Rider. You also got origins, like in Detective 168. That's the first origin of the Joker. Now this is in high demand because people want those key books. A key book is something that people gravitate towards and really want. You also got things like cameo appearances where they briefly appear. You know, you got Fantastic Four 67, where the Warlock, Adam Warlock, briefly appears as the him. So that makes that book a key example of something that people want. Then you also got where artists first start. You know, you got a good run of Todd McFarlane on Amazing Spider-Man. So he starts off in Amazing Spider-Man 298, and people really love Todd McFarlane, so they like that run that he has that goes all the way up to 328. The same can be said with writers. You know, Frank Miller did a really nice run in Daredevil, and that starts with number 158. And then he was an artist at first, but then became a writer and artist in Daredevil 168. Then you got things like classic or iconic covers. Those are covers that people tend to gravitate towards. You might see them on posters or t-shirts or things like that, like Silver Surfer number 4. People really love that cover. Then you got signature series. Those are where you get autographs, and they can be from, you know, writers, artists. They can even be from an actor that played that character in a movie or a TV show. And they get signed and verified. Those can bring up the value and bring up the demand of a certain particular comic book. And then you got little variants of things, like a newsstand variant versus a direct edition, or it could be a Canadian price variant. All those different things can create different value on the same comic book. But then we also got the age of the comic book. How old is it? US comic books started back in 1842. This was known as the Victorian Age. Now, a lot of these comics were still being made over in Europe and being brought over here, but this was pretty much the start. And then next you got the Platinum Age, and that started in 1897. And this is where you start getting the funnies, like Buster Brown, Little Nemo, and Mutt and Jeff, things like that. And then in 1938 started the Golden Age, and this is where we got superheroes first introduced. Things like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Captain America. Now this ran all the way up until 1956, and then we got the Silver Age of comic books. This is where we see heavy hitters like Spider-Man, Hulk, the X-Men, and that ran all the way up until the Bronze Age, which is in 1970, and that started with Green Lantern number 76. And this first started is because it was kind of like when adults started reading comics as a kid, but now are in the comic industry and wanted more adult themes. And they started dealing with different themes like drug use and even overdosing. And that ran all the way up into the Copper Age, which started in 1984, which gave the rise to the independent comic book artists such as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And then that ran all the way up until the Nickel Age, which was in 1996, because we had a massive comic book boom and then a comic book crash, and that was the end of the crash. Then the Nickel Age ran all the way up to 2008, which from then on is now called the Modern Age of comic books. And the reason why that happened is because that was the start of the MCU, which pretty much changed the landscape of comic books. So having an older comic book, that can make a comic book much more valuable because it becomes much more rare. But then again, just because it's old doesn't mean it's valuable. You can have older superheroes that faded away in the Golden Age that no one really cares about now, and that comic book isn't really worth that much, even though it could be nearly 100 years old. That brings me to the next category, rarity. How many actually are there? The reason why Action Comics number 1 is so expensive is because it's really rare. There's not that many that are out there. Less than 75 have been graded by CGC. So that means it's very, very rare, which boosts the price very, very high. If there's thousands available, like say 10,000 Action Comics number 1 from 1938, that comic book would not be worth nearly what it is today, which is in the millions. It'd be probably worth more into the thousands. Our next category is variants. Now, variants can create demand. So what exactly is a variant? Variants more exist in modern comic books, like newer comic books, probably from the 90s and up. It's basically where they take a cover, which will be called cover A, and that will be the normal one. And then they'll make a variant of that cover. They'll take another comic book artist and they'll draw a brand new cover for that exact same comic book. Now there's different types of variants. There's ones that have a limited run, like maybe they only make 500 of this particular variant, or they'll have a ratio variant, which will be something where a comic book shop will have to order at least 25 of the normal cover A, and then they'll get one of this 1 in 25 variant. It could be 100, it could be 200. And that's another way they create rarity of a certain particular book, is by having variants. There's also printings, like first, second, third, maybe fourth, fifth, or sixth. And each printing could have a slightly different cover, or maybe an entirely new cover altogether. Now, usually the first printing is always the most valuable, but sometimes, once in a while, you can have a third printing, say like Hulk number 377, where it's actually more expensive than the first printing just because there wasn't that many printed to begin with, and it's more desired because the variant of that cover probably maybe looks cooler or a little bit better. Now the next category is grade, and this is probably one of the more important categories. So what is grade? Now remember when I said something is a CGC 9.0? Well, that's the grade, is the 9.0. Grading for comics go out on a 10-point scale. It goes all the way down from the bottom, which will be coverless, which means there's no cover at all. And then it starts at a 0.5 if there's basically some of the cover that still exists, maybe pieces are missing, and that's the lowest grade. Then it goes all the way up to a 10.0, and that is a perfect grade. Now the difference between a 0.5 and a 10.0 is how much damage it has. It could have pieces missing, it could have little bends in it, little cover loss. It could be all sorts of things that go wrong with the book. Basically, the worse shape that it's in, the lower the grade goes. Now, the higher the grade, that's the more expensive, more desired. So a 10.0 is going to be the most desired, which means the most valuable, all the way down to a 0.5, which is the least desired, and it's going to be the least valuable. Now, remember when I said CGC? Well, CGC is a grading company, and you can send your comic book off to them to be graded. So there's two different types of grading. There's raw or ungraded, and then there's graded. So graded just means you sent it off to one of those companies, and there's many different companies out there, but CGC is probably the most preferred one and the one I would recommend the most. And then there's raw or ungraded, which means it's not officially graded by a third-party grader, and usually people will grade it themselves based on that same 10-point scale, but that comes with a lot of risk. There's different types of grading when you get your book back. There's universal, which means it's unrestored. And what unrestored means is it's untouched by someone now. And restored is basically where you take a comic book and say there's a piece missing, you'll add in a piece. Or maybe there's some like cuts or like spine splits where it's tears or something like that, and someone's come and patched that up. Or maybe there's little stresses on it where it lost some color, and someone will come on with like a pen or a marker and color that part in. That's called color touch. Or maybe it's really raggeded on the edges, and someone will trim it where they cut off sides of the book to make it look more straight and uniformed. All that is considered restoration, which is actually very, very bad. You don't want that. That is no good. So basically, you're taking a book that looks kind of damaged and trying to make it look a lot better. You do not want to do that in comic books because that devalues the book, even though it might come back a better grade. So maybe you take a 5.0 and touch it up and make it look nicer, and now it's like an 8.0, but it's going to be worth a lot less than that 5.0 originally was, because people in the comic industry do not like restored books as much. The only time they really go after restored books is if they want a certain particular book, but they can't afford the unrestored version, the universal grade version, so they'll pay less to get a restored copy just so they have that book. Next would be qualified. That usually comes back a green label. That means there's something weird wrong with it, like it could have a coupon cutout or an entire page missing, or it could have maybe like big holes through it, like someone put it through a binder, things like that. And then you got signature series, which of course means that it was verified by CGC to have the actual signatures there. Usually they verify it because they're physically there. So if you go to a signing of Todd McFarlane, there's CGC watching to make sure that got verified as Todd McFarlane, then you get a gold label. If CGC wasn't there to verify it, then you'll get a green label. There's also conserved, which means it's kind of like restoration, but just a lot less stuff. Usually this is minor restoration just so the book doesn't basically fall apart. But again, that is less desired as well. Then you got page quality, and that is the quality of the page or the color of the pages. It goes all the way from white, then you can go off-white, then you can go cream, then you go tan, and then you go brittle. Brittle is the worst. It means it's so dark, it's just falling apart in your hands. Then you got tan. Tan's obviously a tan color. White pages is the best. That is the one that's most desired. Now, if you factor in how much does that determine the value, not nearly as much as the grade. So the grade, like a 5.0, 6.0, that determines the value way more than pages. Pages is slightly add a little value if you got the white pages versus, say, an off-white or a cream page. So out of all those categories, which is the most important in determining the value or the demand of that comic book? Well, it's the first appearance. That is the most important one. So an action number 1 versus an action number 2. One is the first appearance of Superman, and that is going to be worth millions of dollars compared to an action number 2, which will be in the tens of thousands, maybe $100,000. It's because it's the first appearance of Superman. Same with a Detective 26 versus a Detective 27. Now, Detective 26 is older, it comes before 27, but Detective 27 is the first appearance of Batman. Detective 26 is not, it's just a comic book. So that first appearance of Batman is worth way more than Detective 26. The next important factor is the grade. Now, the grade of that comic book. If you have an action number 1 at a 5.0 versus a 9.0, huge difference, huge difference. Just like even if you have a more common book like a Hulk 181 at a 2.0 versus a 9.8, a 9.8 is worth almost $100,000. A 2.0 could be worth a couple thousand. The rest of the categories are important, but not nearly as important as the other ones. You just got to make sure the difference between a restored and an unrestored. Always go for the unrestored one. That is the one that's going to be a lot more desired by people out there and a lot more investable. So some common questions about CGC and grading. Why should you even get your comics graded to begin with? Well, for protection. It's protection monetarily and protection physically. So when you have them in the cases, these cases are hard plastic, and they also are inside a little tiny softer plastic. So it protects it from damage. Say you drop the comic book, say you're moving and the moving box gets thrown across the room. This hard plastic shell will protect it from the damages that could happen if your book wasn't in this nice protective case. Also, it protects it as an investment. You can easily sell this to the next buyer with very little questions because it's already been officially graded and they trust that company, so therefore they trust that book when you sell it to them. So what is the best grading company to use? Well, I say CGC. The reason why is they've been around the longest, they have a very good reputation, and they also hold their value and actually command the most value when you go to sell your comic book. So is it better to buy an already graded comic book or get a comic graded that's ungraded? Well, if you're just starting out, I would suggest buying a graded comic book already. Buying an ungraded comic book actually takes a lot more skill, as you have to learn how to grade. You have to learn how to spot restoration, because there's a lot of people that may know or not know, and they'll sell you a comic book and it comes back restored. Or there's a page that's been cut out and another page that's been put in, and that's married. So that's very complicated stuff that takes a lot more time to learn. So if you're just starting out, just buy an already graded book. It gives you the peace of mind that a professional has looked at it and can tell what's wrong with it and give you a solid grade and tell you if it's unrestored or restored. But let's say you already have comic books. Should you send them to get graded? Well, to send a comic book to get graded is going to cost money. Depending on the tier, and the tier means how old is it and how valuable it is. The more valuable the comic, the more expensive it is to grade that comic book. I would suggest, though, only grade comic books that have at least some value in it, because it's going to cost you at least a minimum $50. There's probably about a $30 grading fee. Then you have to ship it there, ship it back, insurance and all that stuff. So if you're sending a book in that's worth $25 and you send it in and it costs you $50 to get graded, well, at the end, you only have a $25 book. So make sure the book has a substantial amount of value before you even send it in. So now that you determined what makes a comic book value, how do you even know how to find what that value is? Well, there's a thing called fair market value, and that's basically what the price of that particular book is worth at that particular time. So how do you find the fair market value of a comic book you may want to get or a comic book you may already have? There's different websites you can go to. There's one called the GPA Analysis. That's the one I personally use. And that will show you the value of different auction books or marketplace books that have been sold, actual sales data. But that is behind a paywall. It's like $10 a month. Now, if you don't want to pay that money, you can go to free sites like eBay and click through their completed listings. So say you're looking for a giant size X-Men #1 and you want one in an 8.0 grade. You can go through their completed listings. Or you could hop over to collectorscomics.com. They have a completed listing site and that's free as well. Or you can go to a big auction house like Heritage and they have a sold section of years of data where you can go and look through that data as well. And you'll want to use these tools because when buying a comic book, you don't want to overpay for a comic book. And also if you have a comic that you're selling, you don't want to price it way too low. So use these tools to figure out basically what is it worth. So now that we determine what makes a comic book valuable, how do we even go about buying comic books? And what do we even buy? For beginners, the main thing you should focus on is blue chip comic books. So what are blue chip comic books? Those are comic books that have a proven track record. They've been around a very long time and have lots of demand from people all around the world wanting to buy them. You can go as far back as Golden Age. You got like Action #1, Detective 27, Captain America Comics #1, Marvel Mysteries #1, All-Star Comics 8, Flash Comics #1. You can get stuff in the Silver Age like Amazing Fantasy 15, Hulk #1, X-Men #1, Amazing Spider-Man #1, Journey of Mystery 83. You can go to the Bronze Age and get things like Hulk 181, Amazing Spider-Man 129, Giant Size X-Men #1. More recent comic books, you can get Turtles #1. You can get Amazing Spider-Man 252, New Mutants 98, Batman Adventures 12. The list goes on and on. I have many videos showing you the top 10 for each different ages in case you want something that's really expensive or something that's less expensive. You can click the links right up here. There's also some investable comic books that are a lot more risky, and those are speculation comic books. You'll see them all the time. Those are ones that have very high rewards but also come with a lot of risks. The reason I would stay away from those is just because they're too risky and you really don't know where those comic characters are going to go. They're usually brought on by a lot of movie and TV hype and touted as the next best thing. I would tend to stay away from them just because you really don't know what's going to happen and it's more of a short-term thing than a long-term investment. Some examples might be New Avengers #7, the first appearance of Illuminati, Black Panther #3, or Vengeance #1, the first appearance of America Chavez. So you might be asking yourself, why aren't these investable? Well, the reason why they're not investable is, for example, Vengeance #1, the first appearance of America Chavez. Where is that character going to be in 5 or 10 years? Right now, people are touting it's like, oh, she's going to be around for a long time. She's going to be in a new movie. All those are all rumors because they haven't actually happened. The only thing we've ever seen her in is actually Doctor Strange #2. For all we know, they could easily X her out of any upcoming movies, and you don't really know what's going to happen. In 5 or 10 years, maybe that character just really doesn't exist in comic books or in movies ever again. So that's why I always tend to go for long-term investments. Those are ones with proven track records, and those are the blue chip comic books. I would stay away from speculation because that is a whole nother beast and that is much harder to predict. So now that we've identified what to buy, where do you even go to buy? Well, there's places like eBay. eBay is probably the biggest. They have auctions and they also have a marketplace where you can just go and pick up a book. Then there's other smaller ones like collectorscomics.com where they run auctions as well and have a marketplace. And then there's like a bigger auction house, which is like Heritage. They've been around for a very long time and they have auctions and a marketplace. But remember, there are fees with this. So many auction houses will have a buyer's premium, so watch out for that. So when you're buying a book for say $1,000, they might have a 20% buyer's premium. So now you have to tack on an extra 20% on that $1,000 book that you just bought. Now, Collectors Comics doesn't have a buyer's premium, nor does eBay, but places like Heritage do have a buyer's premium. Now there's also taxes. You got to look for taxes, and each state has different taxes and how they work. So remember to factor that in. And then when you go to sell your book, there's seller fees. Now, seller fees can be quite low to quite high. CollectorsComics.com has 0% sellers fees, but places like eBay is roughly about 15%. Then places like Heritage could be as high as 15% for sellers fees, but also remember there's that buyer's premium. So when a buyer goes to buy a particular book, they're factoring all those things. So if you add that together, you're going to look at nearly 30% in fees. But remember, you make the most money when you're buying. So here are some tips. Search for good deals. There's a lot of good deals out there. You just got to search and be patient. Don't give in to FOMO. There's going to be a lot of hype about certain books or even new books that say, you must buy this now. Remember, do your research and be patient. If you do a lot of research, you'll see and you'll be able to clear through all that FOMO. If you're buying from a marketplace, try and message the dealer. See if you can talk them down and work out some kind of deal. Usually they will. But usually you get the best deals in auctions. So go to a bunch of different auction sites and watch them all, and eventually a book will pop up that you want. But don't get into a bidding war where you end up paying a little too much than you really wanted to. But if you do pay a little too much, it's not that big of a deal if you go for the right book. Because if you pay, say, 5% over the fair market value, you won't really remember that 5% you overpaid in the next 10 years when your book is up by like 300, 400%. Remember to identify your goal. Going in, what is your goal of this? Is it long-term investing or short-term? I recommend for all beginner people, just go with long-term. That is much easier, and you can just pick certain books and you don't have to really worry about it and do a bunch of research and figuring out when to sell, because short-term, it's like you could buy it now and you could have to sell it in like 3 days, or maybe it's 3 months from now. So just go with the long-term. Long-term, I'm meaning like 5 to 10 years. Also, stay away from modern comic books and variants, as those are the most susceptible to FOMO and hype. They are super risky because they don't have a proven track record yet. They are much more suited for short-term investing, as they have such wild swings. They can go way up and then shoot way back down, all within a couple months. Just remember, supply and demand. But it's also, what type of demand is it? If you have a comic book, there's only 100 that exist, and there's 1,000 people that want it, but all those 1,000 people are, the most they'll ever pay is $5, then that comic book will always be worth only $5. So I hope this video can help guide you through your investing in comic books path. But remember, comic books are meant to be enjoyed. So even if they don't go up in value as much as you hoped or wanted, at least you enjoyed them while you had them. I'm David from the Comic Book Investments. Have a great day.